Paris, May 1952. Thomas Braden stood in the marble halls of the Musée National d'Art Moderne, watching French intellectuals circle Jackson Pollock's No. 1A 1948 like it was a crime scene. The massive canvas, a chaotic explosion of dripped paint that looked like nothing so much as a drunk spider had danced across it, dominated the gallery. Braden, officially a cultural affairs officer, but actually the CIA's chief of International Organizations Division, suppressed a smile as a Communist Party critic loudly declared it capitalist decadence and the death throes of bourgeois art. Perfect. 6,000 miles away in Washington, Senator George Dondereau was at that very moment denouncing abstract art on the House floor as shackled to communist ideology. In New York, conservative groups were demanding museums remove un-American modern art from their walls. The American public largely agreed. Polls showed most Americans thought abstract expressionism was either a communist plot or a practical joke, possibly both. Yet here was Braden, a CIA operative, using agency money funneled through foundations and cultural organizations to ship this supposedly degenerate American art across Europe. The paintings that half of America wanted banned, the CIA was spending millions to promote. Not despite the controversy, but because of it. Because in the cultural Cold War, chaos was the point. The Soviets had socialist realism, predictable, propagandistic, state-approved. America had Pollock throwing paint at canvas in an alcoholic fury. And somehow, improbably, the paint-throwing drunk was winning. What Braden understood, standing in that Paris gallery in 1952, was something most Americans wouldn't learn for another 15 years. The Central Intelligence Agency had become the most important patron of avant-garde art in American history. The ultimate irony of the Cold War was about to unfold. Totalitarians would fight over whose freedom was more genuine by arguing about splattered paint. The strategy seemed brilliant to the CIA's cultural warriors, even if it would have horrified most American taxpayers. In the early 1950s, as the Cold War settled into what George Kennan called a long twilight struggle, U.S. intelligence operatives confronted an uncomfortable reality. The Soviet Union was winning the battle for hearts and minds among European intellectuals. The Soviets had done an excellent job of mobilizing progressive intellectuals in Europe, recalled Michael Josselson, who ran the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom. Picasso was a party member. Sartre was fellow traveling. The entire intellectual establishment in France and Italy seemed to believe that communism represented the future of human culture. American policymakers watched with alarm as Soviet cultural diplomacy scored victory after victory. The World Peace Council, secretly funded by Moscow, drew millions to its rallies. Soviet ballet companies toured to rapturous applause. Most galling of all, European artists and writers, the very people who should have been natural allies of liberal democracy, seemed convinced that capitalism was sterile, that bourgeois America had nothing to offer but Coca-Cola and conformity. We were losing the cultural Cold War, and losing it badly, said Tom Braden, who headed the CIA's International Organizations Division from 1950 to 1954. In his infamous 1967 article, "I'm Glad the CIA is Immoral," Braden explained the thinking. I remember the enormous joy I got when the Boston Symphony Orchestra won more acclaim for the U.S. in Paris than John Foster Dulles or Dwight D. Eisenhower could have bought with 100 speeches. The CIA's solution was counterintuitive. Fight socialist realism not with Norman Rockwell and wholesome Americana, but with the most radical, individualistic, uncontrolled art America produced. Abstract expressionism became the agency's secret weapon precisely because it couldn't be controlled, because it celebrated individual vision over state dictates, because it was messy and free and utterly incompatible with totalitarian aesthetics. We wanted to show that America valued freedom of expression, that our artists could do whatever they wanted, explained Donald Jameson, a CIA case officer involved in cultural operations. The fact that most Americans hated abstract art was actually a plus. It proved the government wasn't controlling what artists created. The initial CIA assessment, drafted in classified memos between 1950 and 1951, identified culture as a crucial Cold War battleground. The Soviets understand that political and economic competition is only part of the struggle, one internal document noted. They recognize that the ultimate victory will be won in the realm of ideas, art, and culture. If communist critics could portray America as a cultural wasteland, they could undermine U.S. influence even in countries that rejected communism economically. CIA Director Allen Dulles approved the cultural offensive in 1950, telling subordinates, "We must use every available weapon in the propaganda war against communism." That weapon would include not just Voice of America broadcasts and CIA-funded magazines, but also touring exhibitions of American abstract art that most American politicians would have been horrified to publicly support. Nelson Rockefeller, whose family foundation became a key CIA cutout for art funding, articulated the logic in private meetings. "We cannot compete with the Soviets in claiming our society is more equal or more planned. We must compete on the grounds of freedom and creativity." The canvases of Pollock, Rothko, de Kooning, and Motherwell would become battlefield terrain in a war fought with paint and propaganda. The weaponization of American art began not with the CIA, but with Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. Both totalitarian regimes understood that modernist art, with its embrace of individualism, abstraction, and freedom from representational constraints, posed an ideological threat to state control. In 1937, Joseph Goebbels organized the Degenerate art exhibition in Munich, displaying modernist works as examples of Jewish and Bolshevik corruption. The same year, Stalin's cultural commissars were enforcing socialist realism as the only acceptable artistic style in the Soviet Union, purging artists who deviated from heroic depictions of workers and peasants. The great Russian avant-garde of the 1920s, Kandinsky, Malevich, Chagall, was denounced, suppressed, or driven into exile. This created an opening for American cultural diplomacy, though few recognized it immediately. During World War II, the Office of War Information had attempted some cultural outreach, but it was ad hoc and temporary. The real infrastructure for cultural Cold War began in 1947 with the creation of the CIA and the beginning of systematic psychological operations. The key architect was Cord Meyer, a Yale graduate and Marine combat veteran who joined the CIA in 1951 and eventually ran covert operations worldwide. Meyer, who had once been an idealistic advocate for world government, became convinced that the Cold War required fighting the Soviets on every front, including culture. "We understood that the Soviets had turned culture into a weapon," Meyer later wrote. "We had no choice but to do the same." Meyer found an ally in Tom Braden, who ran the International Organizations Division. Braden's division operated through a dizzying network of foundations, cultural organizations, and intermediaries designed to obscure CIA involvement. The agency couldn't be seen directly funding American art that would play into Soviet propaganda about state control. Instead, they created what one historian called a consortium of influence. The key front organization was the Congress for Cultural Freedom, CCF, established in 1950 in West Berlin with CIA money funneled through the Farfield Foundation. The CCF's founding conference brought together prominent anti-communist intellectuals, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Sidney Hook, Arthur Koestler, Ignacio Silone. Its stated mission was defending intellectual freedom against Soviet totalitarianism. Its secret mission was serving as a CIA cutout for cultural operations worldwide. We couldn't just go to an organization and say, "I'm from the CIA and I'd like to support you," Braden explained years later. That would have been the kiss of death. Instead, the agency created foundations that appeared independent, staffed them with witting and unwitting collaborators, and let them disperse money to artists, musicians, writers, and cultural institutions. The Museum of Modern Art in New York became an unwitting and sometimes witting partner in this effort. MoMA's international program, established in 1952, organized touring exhibitions of American abstract expressionism that traveled to Europe, Latin America, and Asia. The museum's president, Nelson Rockefeller, had served as coordinator of inter-American affairs during World War II, running what was essentially a cultural propaganda office. His connections to intelligence circles were extensive and well documented. MoMA's director, René Darnoncourt, genuinely believed in promoting American modernism, but he also understood the Cold War stakes. In this time of world conflict, he told the museum's board in 1952, "We must show that a free society can produce vital and challenging art." Whether he knew the CIA was helping fund these exhibitions through circuitous channels remains disputed, but the alignment of interests was clear. The artists themselves were largely kept in the dark. Jackson Pollock, the Wyoming-born painter whose drip technique epitomized abstract expressionism, was drinking himself to death in Long Island, entirely unaware his paintings were serving as Cold War propaganda. Mark Rothko, Robert Motherwell, Willem de Kooning, none knew the CIA had identified them as cultural warriors in America's arsenal. Early operations were modest. The CCF funded magazines like Encounter in Britain and Proofs in France, which published articles championing American cultural achievements. They sponsored concerts, bringing American jazz musicians to Europe, another CIA-approved cultural export, Black American jazz, as proof the U.S. wasn't simply racist. And they began organizing art exhibitions, starting small before scaling up to major shows in Paris, Venice, and other cultural capitals. By 1954, the operation was sophisticated and well-funded. The CIA was spending approximately $20 million annually on cultural operations through various fronts. Roughly $200 million in today's dollars. A classified 1954 memo noted, "The Congress for Cultural Freedom has been of significant assistance to the achievement of the agency's objectives in the field of cultural affairs." The watershed moment came not in one dramatic confrontation, but across 3 pivotal years between 1955 and 1958, when the CIA's cultural offensive achieved critical mass and abstract expressionism went from Cold War curiosity to America's most potent cultural export. Venice Biennale, June 1956. The Venice Biennale, the Olympics of the art world, had long been dominated by European artists and Soviet-approved social realists. The Soviet pavilion displayed massive paintings of heroic workers building dams, soldiers liberating villages, collective farm achievements. Everything was literal, triumphant, state-approved. Then visitors entered the American pavilion. 4 massive Jackson Pollock canvases confronted them, enormous explosions of color and energy that seemed to embody chaos itself. Autumn Rhythm, a 17-foot-wide cascade of dripped paint, dominated one wall. To European critics raised on Renaissance masters and even Soviet literalism, Pollock's work was shocking, and that was exactly the point. The contrast could not have been starker, recalled Catherine Koo, the curator who helped organize the exhibition. The Soviets were showing what their government wanted artists to paint. We were showing what our artists chose to paint, whether the government approved or not. Behind the scenes, the international program at MoMA, with CIA money flowing through the Farfield Foundation and Rockefeller Brothers Fund, had spent months ensuring the American pavilion made maximum impact. They commissioned the exhibition, arranged shipping, covered insurance, even paid for a glossy catalog that was distributed free throughout Europe. The Soviet response was predictable but still satisfying to CIA observers. Pravda denounced Pollock's work as a pathological display of bourgeois decadence and evidence of capitalism's spiritual emptiness. Soviet art critics wrote screeds about how abstract expressionism proved American culture was dying. One particularly vitriolic review in Izvestia claimed the paintings represented the death rattle of a society that has lost all moral bearings. Tom Braden, reading these reviews in his CIA office, could barely contain his satisfaction. The Soviets had fallen into the trap. By attacking abstract expressionism as decadent and American, they had made it impossible for European intellectuals to dismiss it without seeming to side with Soviet censorship. The very vehemence of Soviet denunciation elevated abstract expressionism into a symbol of freedom. The more the Soviets attacked our art, the more European intellectuals defended it. Braden wrote in an internal memo, "We couldn't have asked for better publicity." The New American Painting Exhibition, 1958 to 1959. The decisive victory came with MoMA's touring exhibition, The New American Painting, which traveled to 8 European cities between 1958 and 1959. The show featured 81 paintings by 17 abstract expressionists: Pollock, Rothko, de Kooning, Motherwell, Klein, Guston, Newman. In Basel, Switzerland, the exhibition drew crowds that lined up around the block. In Paris, the response was particularly gratifying. French intellectuals, who had long dismissed American culture as shallow, found themselves confronted with art that was undeniably serious, sophisticated, and original. The French communist newspaper L'Humanité attacked the show as CIA propaganda, which it was. But this only made left-leaning but anti-totalitarian intellectuals more determined to defend it. "We began to see a shift," recalled Michael Josselson, who ran the Congress for Cultural Freedom. European intellectuals who had been sympathetic to Moscow started questioning whether Soviet cultural policy was really progressive. How could a system that banned this kind of artistic freedom claim to represent the future? CIA operatives tracked media coverage obsessively. An internal agency assessment from June 1958 noted, "The New American Painting Exhibition has generated extensive positive coverage in European press. Soviet attempts to dismiss the works as decadent have largely backfired, making USSR appear culturally conservative and repressive. Recommend continued support for similar initiatives." The CIA's investment was paying dividends beyond art criticism. European intellectuals who engaged with abstract expressionism found themselves questioning other Soviet cultural positions. If Moscow was wrong about art, what else might they be wrong about? The cultural opening created political opportunities. The defections begin, 1957-1959. Perhaps most satisfying to the CIA were the defections, not of spies, but of intellectuals. Stephen Spender, the British poet who had flirted with communism in the 1930s, became a vocal anti-Soviet voice after engaging with American modernism. French philosopher Raymond Aron, already anti-communist, found his position strengthened by the cultural contrast. Even György Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist philosopher, privately admitted that socialist realism was an artistic dead end, though he couldn't say so publicly. "We were winning people over one mind at a time," Kordmeyer wrote in his classified reports. The exhibitions, the magazines, the concerts, they all contributed to creating an intellectual climate where Soviet claims about superior culture became laughable. The turning point wasn't one dramatic moment, but a cascade of exhibitions, reviews, debates, and defections between 1955 and 1959. By the time Pollock died in a car crash in August 1956 at age 44, drunk as usual, he had become an unwitting Cold War hero. His paintings hung in museums from London to Tokyo, symbols of a free society that could produce art the Soviets could never match. The CIA tracked success through metrics that would have bemused the artists themselves. Column inches of European press coverage, attendance figures at exhibitions, shifts in intellectual opinion polls, even the vehemence of Soviet denunciations, considered a leading indicator of effectiveness. A classified CIA assessment from December 1958 concluded, "Cultural operations have proven among our most cost-effective tools in combating Soviet influence in Western Europe. The investment in promoting American abstract expressionism has yielded returns far exceeding initial projections. Recommend continued and expanded funding." As abstract expressionism proved its value as a cultural weapon, both superpowers adapted their strategies in an escalating propaganda war fought on canvas and in gallery spaces worldwide. American Escalation and Sophistication, 1959–1965. The CIA didn't rest on its success. By 1960, the cultural operation had become remarkably sophisticated, with multiple overlapping programs designed to promote American creativity, while maintaining plausible deniability about government involvement. The Congress for Cultural Freedom expanded dramatically, eventually supporting over 20 magazines in 35 countries. Encounter in London, Proofs in Paris, Quadrant in Australia, Quest in India, all secretly funded by the CIA, all championing American cultural achievement while maintaining editorial independence that kept contributors unaware of the funding source. "We were very careful about editorial control," explained Lawrence de Neufville, a CIA officer who worked on CCF operations. "The magazines had to maintain credibility, which meant the editors needed real independence. We couldn't dictate content, but we could ensure that broadly anti-Soviet perspectives got financial support." The agency funneled money through an increasingly complex network of foundations. The Farfield Foundation, headed by Julius Fleischmann, served as the primary CIA cutout for CCF funding. But other foundations joined the effort. The Hoblitzell Foundation in Dallas, the Beacon Fund in Boston, the J.M. Kaplan Fund in New York. Most foundation staff had no idea they were part of a CIA operation. Money was moved through multiple accounts to obscure its origins. MoMA's international program became even more aggressive. Between 1952 and 1967, it organized more than 100 exhibitions touring 30 countries. The New American Painting was followed by Contemporary American Prints, 1960, Recent Painting USA, The Figure, 1962, and Word and Image, 1968. Each show was carefully curated not just for artistic merit, but for cultural impact. Porter McCrae, who directed the international program, later acknowledged the Cold War context. "We wanted to show the world that American artists were as sophisticated and innovative as any in Europe. That America wasn't just Hollywood and hamburgers." Whether he knew about CIA funding remains unclear, but declassified documents show agency officials discussing MoMA exhibitions in operational memos. The agency also branched into other cultural fronts. The Boston Symphony Orchestra's 1952 European tour received covert CIA support. Jazz musicians, Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, Dave Brubeck, toured as cultural ambassadors, often with CIA money paying their way. "We wanted to show American culture in all its diversity," Tom Braden explained. Jazz and abstract art both communicated freedom in ways words never could. Soviet countermeasures. The Khrushchev dilemma. Moscow's response revealed the fundamental disadvantage of totalitarian art policy. Nikita Khrushchev, who consolidated power after Stalin's death in 1953, faced an impossible dilemma: how to compete culturally without loosening state control over art. Khrushchev tried having it both ways. His 1956 secret speech denouncing Stalin's excesses suggested a cultural thaw might come. Some Soviet artists dared to experiment with less rigidly propagandistic work. But Khrushchev himself remained deeply conservative about art, famously exploding in rage at an exhibition of modernist Soviet art in 1962. "What is this?" Khrushchev shouted at the exhibition, according to witnesses. "These pederasts and their filthy paintings, we aren't going to spend our money on this." He called abstractionist works dog shit and threatened to exile artists who didn't return to socialist realism. The incident revealed the Soviet bind. They couldn't embrace modernism without undermining state control over culture. But by rejecting it, they confirmed Western propaganda about Soviet cultural repression. Every denunciation of abstract art made Khrushchev sound like the narrow-minded bureaucrat CIA operations were designed to portray. "We watched Khrushchev's art tirades with absolute delight," recalled Donald Jameson, a CIA case officer. "Every time he attacked modern art, he proved our point about Soviet cultural bankruptcy." Soviet cultural authorities tried fighting back with their own propaganda. They increased exports of ballet, classical music, and approved visual art, areas where Soviet technical excellence was undeniable. The Bolshoi Ballet's tours drew praise worldwide. Soviet pianists like Emil Gilels and Sviatoslav Richter impressed Western audiences. But these triumphs in traditional arts only emphasized Soviet failure in contemporary creativity. The expansion, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. By the early 1960s, the CIA's cultural offensive expanded beyond Europe. As decolonization created dozens of new nations in Africa and Asia, cultural diplomacy became a crucial tool in preventing Soviet influence in the developing world. Abstract expressionism traveled to São Paulo, Tokyo, Lagos, and Nairobi. The CIA understood that newly independent nations, seeking to establish modern identities, might find abstract art more appealing than Soviet-style propaganda. "These countries wanted to be modern," explained one CIA assessment. Abstract expressionism offered them a vision of modernity that wasn't tied to either Soviet or European colonial aesthetics. The operation wasn't universally successful. Some cultures found abstract expressionism baffling or irrelevant. A 1963 exhibition in Delhi received mixed reviews, with one Indian critic writing, "We have escaped British cultural imperialism only to face American cultural imperialism." But even hostile reactions served CIA purposes by generating debate about freedom of expression versus state-controlled art, growing sophistication and unwitting collaborators. By the mid-1960s, the operation involved hundreds of unwitting collaborators, artists, critics, curators, foundation officers, who genuinely believed in promoting American art and had no idea CIA money was funding their work. This was the genius of the operation. The art world didn't need to be told to promote abstract expressionism. It wanted to promote it. The CIA simply provided funding and logistical support for activities that cultural professionals already believed in. As one former CIA officer put it, "We weren't making them do anything they didn't want to do. We were just making it easier for them to do it." Critics like Clement Greenberg, who championed abstract expressionism in influential essays, had no CIA connection and needed none. Dealers like Leo Castelli, who represented abstract expressionists, operated independently. The beauty of the operation was that the art world promoted American modernism for its own reasons, while the CIA provided invisible support that amplified their efforts. The operation reached its zenith in 1966-1967, just as it began to unravel, a perfect illustration of the double-edged nature of covert cultural operations. The cultural high point, 1966. By 1966, abstract expressionism had achieved global dominance in the art world. Major museums worldwide mounted exhibitions. Art historians in university departments taught Pollock and Rothko as canonical figures. Young artists from Tokyo to Buenos Aires to Lagos imitated the abstract expressionist style. The CIA's investment of roughly $200 million over 15 years, adjusted for inflation, had yielded extraordinary returns. The cultural shift was measurable. A CIA assessment from May 1966 noted, "American abstract expressionism is now widely recognized as the dominant art movement of the post-war period. Soviet attacks on decadent bourgeois art have largely ceased, as they proved counterproductive. European intellectual support for Soviet cultural positions has declined significantly since 1950. The Congress for Cultural Freedom had grown into a global operation, spending approximately $5 million annually, about $45 million in today's dollars, supporting 20 magazines, organizing conferences, funding exhibitions, and sponsoring individual artists and intellectuals. Over 100 CIA officers worked on cultural operations globally. An estimated 1,000 cultural figures received CCF support, most unknowingly. The moment of maximum impact came at the Documenta exhibition in Kassel, Germany, in summer 1968. American abstract art dominated the show, with entire galleries devoted to Pollock, Rothko, Newman, and others. European critics, who had dismissed American art as derivative and shallow in the 1940s, now acknowledged American leadership in contemporary art. "We had won the cultural Cold War," one CIA officer later reflected. Soviet art looked hopelessly dated, propagandistic, and controlled. American art looked vital, free, and innovative. Mission accomplished. The revelation, 1967. Then it all came crashing down. In March 1967, Ramparts magazine, a leftist San Francisco publication investigating CIA covert operations, published a devastating expose. The CIA, in bed with whom? The article revealed that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a CIA front, that dozens of American foundations and cultural organizations had received agency money, and that much of the post-war cultural diplomacy had been secretly orchestrated by intelligence operatives. The article named names: the Farfield Foundation, the Hoblit-Sell Foundation, Julius Fleischmann. It traced money flows from CIA accounts through multiple cutouts to CCF offices in Paris. It quoted anonymous former CIA officers confirming the operation. Most damningly, it revealed that numerous prominent intellectuals had been unwitting tools of CIA propaganda. The reaction was explosive. Stephen Spender, the British poet who edited Encounter, resigned in humiliation after learning his magazine was CIA-funded. Other intellectuals scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The New York Times ran front-page stories. Congressional hearings began. President Lyndon Johnson ordered an investigation. "We felt betrayed," wrote British historian Hugh Trevor Roper, who had contributed to CCF publications. "We thought we were promoting ideas because we believed in them. To learn we had been pawns in a propaganda operation was mortifying." Tom Braden, by then retired from the CIA, defended the program in a now infamous article titled, "I'm Glad the CIA is Immoral." He argued that the cultural operation was not only justified, but essential. In much of Europe in the 1950s, socialists, people who called themselves left, the very people whom many Americans thought no better than communists, were the only people who gave a damn about fighting communism. I'm glad the CIA is immoral. I'm glad it took money from the Ford Foundation and passed it to the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Jackson Pollock, who had died in 1956, was spared the knowledge that his paintings had become CIA propaganda. Other artists reacted with fury or resignation. Mark Rothko, asked about the revelation before his suicide in 1970, reportedly said, "The paintings mean what they mean regardless of who paid for them to be shown." The aftermath and assessment. The scandal effectively ended the CIA's direct involvement in cultural operations. The CCF was reorganized as the International Association for Cultural Freedom, with openly acknowledged funding sources. MoMA's international program continued, but with greater scrutiny. The apparatus that had promoted abstract expressionism for 17 years was dismantled within months. Yet, the cultural impact endured. Abstract expressionism remained dominant in the art world long after CIA support ended. Museums continued mounting exhibitions. Universities taught the movement as a crucial moment in art history. Young artists continued working in abstract styles. The paintings themselves retained their power and meaning, independent of their Cold War context. Declassified documents later revealed the scale of the operation. Between 1950 and 1967, the CIA spent approximately $200–300 million in today's dollars on cultural operations worldwide. The Congress for Cultural Freedom alone supported over 20 magazines, organized dozens of conferences, and funded hundreds of exhibitions. An estimated 1,000 cultural figures received some form of CCF support. Did it work? Measuring cultural influence is notoriously difficult, but several indicators suggest success. European intellectual support for Soviet positions did decline significantly between 1950 and 1967. American cultural prestige increased dramatically. Abstract expressionism did become the dominant post-war art movement. Whether this was worth the cost and the scandal remains debated. "We won the cultural battle, but lost the moral high ground," reflected one former CIA officer years later. American art triumphed, but at the cost of making everyone wonder whether anything in the cultural sphere was genuine or just propaganda. The CIA's covert sponsorship of abstract expressionism remains one of the Cold War's most bizarre ironies. A government agency that couldn't acknowledge what it was doing, promoting art that most government officials despised, to prove that America didn't control its artists the way the Soviets did. The operation succeeded in its primary objective. By the 1960s, American abstract expressionism had achieved global recognition, while Soviet socialist realism was widely dismissed as propagandistic. The CIA's investment helped establish American cultural leadership that persists today. New York replaced Paris as the center of the art world, a position it still holds. Yet the 1967 revelation created lasting damage. Intellectuals who had participated in CCF activities felt manipulated. The scandal reinforced left-wing suspicions that American cultural institutions were propaganda tools. Every subsequent government cultural initiative faced accusations of hidden agendas and manipulation. The fundamental paradox was never resolved. The CIA promoted freedom of expression through covert manipulation, celebrated individualism through organized programs, and proved America's cultural superiority by secretly funding it. The paintings themselves were genuine expressions of artistic freedom, but the context of their promotion was anything but. What endures is the art itself. Jackson Pollock's drip paintings hang in major museums worldwide, valued for their innovation and power regardless of their Cold War role. The same is true for Rothko's color fields, de Kooning's abstractions, and Motherwell's compositions. The paintings transcended their propaganda purpose to become legitimate masterpieces, perhaps the ultimate irony of the entire operation. The story reveals a deeper truth about the Cold War. It was fought not just with missiles and spies, but with symphonies and paintings, with ideas and images. In that struggle, the CIA bet that American freedom and creativity could outcompete Soviet control and propaganda. They were right, even if the methods used to prove it contradicted the values being celebrated. Today, knowing the CIA's role doesn't diminish the art, but does complicate our understanding of cultural influence and soft power. Every major cultural movement exists in a political context. What makes the abstract expressionist story unique is how explicitly, if secretly, that context was manipulated by intelligence operatives who understood that in the battle for hearts and minds, a Jackson Pollock painting might be as powerful as a nuclear weapon. The ultimate legacy? America did prove more creative than the USSR, but it took a covert intelligence operation to make sure the world noticed.